Good afternoon. Welcome to the seventh annual Mossadegh Servant Leadership Lecture at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, featuring Dr. Abbas Hamanat of Yale University. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mato Farzaneh, and I'm honored to be your host today. I'm also an associate professor of history and the principal of the Mossadegh Initiative here at Northeastern. Usually, our guests are invited to campus, and before their talk, they meet with the university leadership, followed by a reception where the public meets the speakers at the Mossadegh Servant Leaders Hall. But due to the pandemic, of course, we've had a virtual but live lecture this year. I have already extended an invitation to our speaker so that whenever he can travel safely, we would be honored to have him come to Chicago to visit our campus for another talk. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the Mossadegh Initiative for those of you who might not be familiar with what it is that we do here. It is, of course, named after the late Iranian Prime Minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. The initiative is a collection of endowed funds that provides for this annual lecture and scholarships to Northeastern students in the College of Business and Management and the College of Arts and Sciences. In addition to the Mossadegh Scholarship given to students twice per year, in 2013, the university also named the main hall of the College of Business Management as the Mossadegh Servant Leaders Hall. The donors who established the Mossadegh funds that allow us to have events such as this and grant scholarships celebrate the late accomplishments of Mohammad Mossadegh. Despite the many challenges he faced during his premiership, he led the parliamentary efforts to nationalize the oil industry in Iran. Due to the gravity of the consequences of that action for its main benefactor, the British, along with the help of American intelligence agencies, overthrew the only democratically elected government of Iran, Mossadegh's government, in the now infamous coup of 1953. At the heart of the Mossadegh's political philosophy stood his genuine desire to serve Iranians. During his efforts to nationalize the oil industry, he was motivated by his desire to serve the public, knowing well what consequences it would have for his personal and political life. That's why we consider him a servant leader among other selfless and determined and exceptional historical persons such as Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. Before we hear from our guest, I would like to introduce you to the Vice President for Institutional Advancement and the Executive Director of the Northeastern Illinois University's Foundation, Mrs. Liesl Downey. Liesl?
Thank you, Professor Farzaneh, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you and your families are well and that you continue to stay safe. On behalf of Northeastern Illinois University and our President, Gloria J. Gibson, I am delighted to welcome you to the 2021 Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh Servant Leadership Lecture. President Gibson expresses her gratitude and support for our event and deeply regrets that she cannot offer remarks in person. As Dr. Farzaneh shared, I am Liesl Downey, and it is my honor to serve as Vice President for Advancement and Executive Director of the NEIU Foundation. We are so grateful to have you from near and Jewish guest, Professor Abbas Amanat. And for those of you who are new to Northeastern, I want to share a little about who we are. Northeastern is a regional public university in Illinois, and we're a federally designated Hispanic-serving, minority-serving institution. Nearly 70% of our 7,000 students are non-white. Our students are often the first in their families to attend university. They may work 1, 2, or sometimes even 3 jobs to support themselves and their families while they earn their education. Many are immigrants or children of immigrants for whom challenges can be compounded. Northeastern's faculty, staff, and supporting programs are focused on providing access to an excellent education for all students. To touch on just a few of our strengths at the university, for 7 years in a row, Northeastern has remained the best in the state and among the nation's leaders at graduating students with the least amount of debt. We're recognized by the Wall Street Journal as the most diverse public comprehensive university in the Midwest. We welcome, accept, respect, and embrace our differences because diversity and equity is at the core of what we do. We're recognized, too, for our ability to move graduates up the socioeconomic ladder. With an NEIU degree, our graduates improve their lives, their families' lives, the lives of our community, state, and world. This moves the needle in the right direction. Finally, Northeastern is a very safe campus. In fact, we're recognized as the 3rd safest campus in the nation, and that distinction is very important to us. Thanks to the efforts of many, including donors here in Chicago and across the country, we are so proud to call Mossadegh Hall and the endowments that it has established home. This space is unique in the world, and again, we are so delighted to welcome this opportunity at Northeastern. These funds, the Mossadegh Initiative funds, create a living resource for education about Dr. Mossadegh, about servant leadership and Persian culture. In past years, thanks to my colleague Dr. Farzaneh, we've hosted classes in Persian language through the initiative. We've hosted a children's story hour in Persian. We've featured movies. And of course, we continue to award substantial scholarships. And of course, as well, events like this afternoon. We are proud to bring in experts like Dr. Amanat from across the country to share their knowledge and insight with our community. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll turn the program back over to Dr. Farzaneh.
Thank you, Lizo. Our speaker will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We might go a little bit longer. If you have any questions or brief comments, please type them in the Q&A box, and I'll be sure to read them. Please note that the chat box and the raised hand features are disabled, so the only way to communicate is through the Q&A box. Please remember that at the end, if you complete the short survey, your name will be entered into a drawing, and the first 5 names drawn will receive a copy of Dr. Amanat's Iran, A Modern History by Yale University Press, which is an outstanding book. I don't have to say it, you will see by yourself, as compliments of the Mossadegh Initiative at Northeastern. Also, I would like to thank the entire staff at the Institutional Advancement and the Foundation, the Alumni Relations, and our Technology Department, especially Damaris Tapia, Brandon DePrato, Terrence Black, and Anu Wu. Thank you for your help. And now let me introduce our speaker as if he needs it, right? Abbas Amanat is William Graham Sumner Professor of History at Yale University and Director of the Yale Program in Iranian Studies. He is a consulting editor of Encyclopedia Iranica and editor-in-chief of a new series on the sources for the study of the Persianate world. He is the author of Iran, A Modern History, that came out in 2017. And since 1983, he has authored 5 other books and numerous edited volumes in Iran, Shiism, the Middle East, and the Persianate world. His most recent co-edited volume is The Persianate World, Rethinking a Shared Space by Brill Publishers. His forthcoming volume in Persian is Ahd Qajar va Sodai Farang, Qajar Covenant and European Anxiety. It will be published in spring of 2021 by Mehri Publications in London. And his forthcoming co-edited volume, The Caspian World in Early Modern and Modern Times, will be published in fall by Cornell University Press. And now, without further ado, please help me virtually welcome Professor Abbas Amanat.
Hello. Let me start thanking Dr. Matteo Farzaneh, who very kindly had invited me a while back. And this is the reality of our today's lives, that we have to communicate through Zoom. And I very much hope that at least some of the excitement of a live lecture can be communicated through. My thanks are due to Northeastern University of Illinois and the Mossadegh Servant Leadership Initiative, which this event is its annual lecture. Let me start by also thanking Ms. Dani and other people who were responsible for inviting me. This is an honor to speak to a group in name of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who probably is one of the great personalities of the 20th century history, not only of Iran, but perhaps one might say the non-West or perhaps worldwide. It's a remarkable figure with a unfortunate, one might say even a tragic end. There is a huge amount of scholarship has been produced over the course of the past 50 years at least, if not longer. And I'm not going to engage this first due to the short time that we have, but also because my focus is, as the abstract would point out, is somewhat different. But nevertheless, it's important to point out 2021, this year, is the 70th anniversary of Dr. Mossadegh's coming to power as the Prime Minister of Iran for the term of office that was about 2.5 years or thereabout, till August of the 1973. And the ousting of himself and his government, as was pointed out by Dr. Farzaneh, due to that, because of that infamous coup. This perhaps is a chance, realizing that there is an initiative devoted to the study of Dr. Mossadegh, to perhaps try to look at his career and his place in modern history of Iran in a broader historical context, rather than focusing on a career in a more specific context. Also, try to see where we can locate him, or what aspects of Iran's, one might say, indigenous political culture has really some bearing in the way that we would be able to evaluate his life and career, given the fact that probably he is one of the last, if not the last, example of the personalities or statesmen or people in position of power that came from a tradition that lasted probably ever since the late antiquity to 20th century. But my focus in particular is going to be on the example, to try to show that how the office of ministerial office and the term of office of Dr. Mossadegh really showed some of the inherent weaknesses of the Iranian state against what can be said historically onslaughts of an often autocratic, self-legitimizing, and perhaps to some extent might be said erratic institution of kingship. And the tension that often prohibited the development of an autonomous institution of the state, and by which I mean the state that it's really should be differentiated from the position of kingship or monarchy. There is a famous say of Dr. Mossadegh, which, as a matter of fact, I think there is a long precedence for it, to the effect that the Shahs ought to reign but not rule, Saltanat, na hukumat. And as a matter of fact, this emphasis by Dr. Mossadegh during his term of office was largely due to this very fact that there was a consistent intrusion to the realm of the premiership and the office or the position of the government or dolat by the rulers throughout, the course of modern Iranian history and even pre-modern Iranian history. One can see probably there is a absence of a clear division of labor, to which I've just alluded, with consequences, important consequences. Since the institution in modern times, and that made the task of differentiating between the ruler and the government more formidable, is the fact that in modern times, and by modern times normally I have in mind the 19th and the 20th centuries, in addition to the obstacles to which I am going to refer in a moment, that was indigenous to the environment or to the political culture of Iran, there are new factors, most significantly the contingencies of a global presence in Iran, and facing most significantly the two important powers at the time that neighbored Iran in the course of the 19th century, the Russian Empire in the north and the British Empire in colonial India and in the Persian Gulf in the south. And later on, of course, in the post-Second World War period and the beginning of the Cold War, Iran had the unfortunate situation of being located between the Soviet Union and the ideology that was supported by the Soviet sympathizers in Iran or supporters in Iran, and a kind of a transitory period when the British Empire gradually in decline as far as its location in the east of Suez, and the emergence of the United States as a new global power. This puts the position of any government, and certainly the government of Iran, in a even more difficult, more formidable position. In addition to that, the job of governing in the 20th century, or for that matter, even in the 19th century, one might say, faced new challenges. The challenges one might call generally political modernity, facing the new tasks of not only what traditionally expected from governments, but basically reforms, establishing a society and a government that meets the standards of a liberal nationalist government in the 20th century. This process of kind of facing a new model of government that started with the constitutional revolution at the turn of the 20th century continued with aspects of democratization, pluralism, popular representation, and these were new tasks that helped, or rather challenged the task of governing, in addition to the old tensions that existed between the office of the ministers and the rulers, the shahs or the kings. I would like to, as a point of perhaps focus for my talk, also point out that one might actually see the oil nationalization the entire movement that started from the late 1940s and in 1951 with the coming of Dr. Mossadegh to power took a more concrete shape as probably the most important attempt to try to control new resources in order to consolidate the position of the state as a position of state building vis-a-vis the contest or the challenge of the monarchy. This, I think, was the task really that has been in a point of a contestation between the government that is the actual government of which is supposed to be autonomous and the intrusion both from the internal sources, that is the Shahs or their entire support by the Iran, the Shahs, including the army, and the demands and contingencies of dealing in a global context with powers that had vested interest in Iran, has been engaged in diplomacy, in wars, and a great deal of intrigue in the politics of Iran. So both this facing the domestic opposition and kind of international hegemony for the control of the resources is really perhaps the most significant characteristic of Mossadegh era. What this, historically speaking, this is a phenomenon that, as I just pointed out, really goes back to the Sasanian Empire of the late antiquity from the 6th century onwards, where we see that the office of the Wazir was created and given a great significance as origins of the term being the Buzurgan Buzurg or Wazargan Wazarg, the leader of the leaders in the government. That was an office that indeed continued in the post-Sasanian era, in the old Islamic period, and up to the modern time. There was, to the extent, in order to define the relationship or to regularize the relationship, rationalize the system to some extent, the idea of the relationship between the kings and the ministers was also conceptualized in what might be called Perso-Islamic political thought. We come across a kind of a concept or a dichotomy here between what has been referred to as the delegative ministerial power versus the executive ministerial power. The first one, delegative, referred to as Vezarat Tafwizi in Persian and in Arabic, as a matter of fact, refers to the position of the minister or chief minister as the one who is being delegated to control the government, to run the affairs of the states, tax collecting, war and peace, all the other activities that is associated with the position of the government, with the function of the government. And the ruler basically reigns and does not interfere in at least the intricate details of the affairs of the state. The other one, the executive ministerial office, is the one that indeed the minister basically enforces the authority of the king or the ruler, namely that you basically, it's the ruler or the king that has the initiative, and only the action is associated, or enforcement is associated with the minister or ministers, one might say. We see in the course of Iranian past, or for that matter, not only in Iran, we find exactly the same phenomenon in the Ottoman Empire. You see that in most of the Islamic world, perhaps even to an extent in the Mughal India of the early modern times, the same phenomenon of the relationship between the rulers and the ministers. Sometimes even in the course of one ruler's reign, you can see there is a shift from delegative to executive power of the ministers, or the function of the ministers. And this, of course, also was associated with the notion of what I would call waziricide, meaning the execution of the wazirs, that unfortunately there are numerous examples of that in the course of Islamic history. It's littered, basically. Ottoman history has numerous examples of that. Iranian history has a fair number of that. I'll come back to that in a moment. This, in effect, one might say, even was a kind of a rite de passage of the young rulers who, at the earliest stages of their rule, usually gave their delegated the authority to the ministers. There are numerous examples of that. But at the latter state of their rule, basically eliminated physically the ministers and took over the position of power and authority and enforced their own will, most of the time rather erratic, rather, one might say, even self-legitimizing kind of a position. This, if I want to draw some kind of a comparison with the rest of the world, if you look at the situation of Iran compared to the rest of the world, what you would see is that in Europe, of course, the same phenomenon. Henry VIII, Louis XIV of France, numerous other rulers of autocratic rulers of Europe faced the same issue of how to differentiate between the state and the position, or the government and the position of the rulers themselves. And this was not easily achieved. In the British case, in the English case, it took the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the whole process before that, decapitation of Charles I and so forth, in order to eventually give the Parliament, British Parliament, a position of authority over the monarchy. In France, a process that starts even before the French Revolution and continues throughout the course of the French Revolution and after, in order, and two stages of imperial empires, the first and the second empire, eventually to come to that kind of an arrangement of the monarchical power before the Republican period and the authority of the government, the ministers. And also, one should bear in mind that this, to a large extent, depended on the one might say the power base of the ministers, whether they would be able to withstand the pressure from the monarchs. In many examples, both Perso-Islamic and to some extent in perhaps the Russian Empire, you would see that the position of ministers generally were weakened because of the fact that they were considered as some kind of property of the rulers. So they were kind of given a status as a slave. But this is not indeed the case in all instances. For instance, in the Iranian case, throughout the Middle Ages and all the way to the 19th century, you would see that many of the ministers were coming from positions, from backgrounds that give them independent resources. They were members of the landed nobility that had their own estates, had their own resources, and had managed to endure for a very long period of time. One great example of that is the House of Giovanni in the late Seljuk and afterwards the height of it during the Ilkhanid period, after the Mongol invasion of Iran in the 13th century. There are numerous other examples of the pre-modern period where you can see that they're coming from the secretarial class, referred to as the dabirs, who have an independent kind of power base. They have independent network of patronage. They are sources of loyalties that associated with their power, with their position, and they managed to survive for a relatively long period because of the fact that they could basically regulate the relationship with the rulers. A great example of that is, of course, the minister par excellence in pre-modern times is Khaja Nizamul Mulk, who himself and his office basically reinvented the very political culture of the Middle Ages, not only in Iran under the Seljuks, but throughout the Islamic world. This association with the ministerial office and the culture of the ministerial office largely evolved and further developed during the Seljuk era under Khaja Nizamul Mulk, who remains a kind of a supreme exemplary, if you like, for many of the ministers of the later period, all the way up to the 19th century. Now, the problem, even if you compare it with the Ottoman example, in Iran is a little bit more complex. As you can see from perhaps late 17th century, early 18th century, in the Ottoman case, there is a differentiation. There is a sense of differentiation between the office of the ministers and the position of the sultans. Even physically, for those of you who may have visited Istanbul and had been to the Topkapi Palace, you may notice that physically, indeed, the two institutions have been differentiated. There is a palace of the Sultan, and there is an office referred to in most of the correspondence as the Sublime Porte, as it's in translation in English and other languages. In Turkish and Persian, Bab-i Ali, which precisely is meaning the same word. It's a different building. It's a building that houses the minister And the sultans, although they come to visit on a weekly basis the affairs of the government and particularly attending to the petitions by the subjects, but they never actually physically are visible in the Sublime Porte. They are usually behind the window on the upper floor that they only observe what's happening. This sense of a differentiation between the two offices is very remarkable. And you can see in the 19th century, an attempt, for instance, in the mid-19th century was made by the famous Mirza Taqi Khan Amir Kabir, perhaps the most renowned minister of the 19th century Qajar period, to try to create a divan khane with the same kind of a idea in mind to differentiate between divan, which is a representation or physical representation of the office and the function of the ministers vis-a-vis the royal palace. And that, of course, survived for a short period of time, but it again was the victim of the onslaught of the ruler, in this case, Nasiruddin Shah and his allies. Now, as a matter of fact, if you look at the course of the 19th century, it is remarkable to see that how the history of ministerial power almost consistently was the victim of this intrusion from the monarchy. I counted perhaps 12 or 13 chief ministers referred to as Sadr Azam in 19th century Iran under the Qajars from, let's say, 1790s to 1905 or before the Constitutional Revolution, because with the Constitutional Revolution, the entire system, the entire discourse changes. But during this long period of more than a century, I counted 12 or 13 chief ministers. Of these 12 or 13 chief ministers, nearly 50%, more than 50%, are the victims of the monarchical intrusion. We find, if I may look, 6 of the 12 were virtually either executed or were murdered in secret. 4 of them under Nasiruddin Shah in the latter part of the 19th century. 1 was assassinated during the course of the Constitutional Revolution. 3 were exiled for life, that is. That was really equivalent of eliminating them altogether from the political stage. And only 2 of them died of natural death. This is an extraordinary figure to keep in mind. That's what I would call the kind of a occupational hazard as far as the prime ministers were concerned. And as a kind of a side anecdote, a fair number of them are not known to have been murdered, but we only know from circumstances that indeed this was the case. Many of them were the victims of what's referred to as the Qajar coffee, that is the poisonous coffee that they were forced to drink when they wanted to, which incidentally has an equivalent in, at least in French history, as far as I know. And by itself is an interesting topic to see who were the victims of the of this Qajar poisonous coffee, as it was referred to. But it's a rather difficult, formidable task to try to find out. But to my great surprise, when I was writing my own book, The Pivot of the Universe, Um, I noticed that 3 of the ministers, of the chief ministers, that were assumed, as far as the chronicles of the period are concerned, of natural death or sudden death for some reason, were, as a matter of fact, victims of deliberate attempt by the ruler, Nasiruddin Shah, and his father, Muhammad Shah. The first of them being the famous literary figure and capable chief minister, Qa'im Maqam, who was killed in secret in the basement of the royal palace in Tehran. The other one, Mirza Agha Khan Nouri, who was killed by the order of, murdered by the order of Nasiruddin Shah. Mirza Taghi Khan Amir Kabir, who was who died in the bathhouse in Kashan by the order of Nasiruddin Shah, and the 2 others, Keshikchi Bashi and Moshir-ud-Dawla, both of them are victims of secret murders by the ruler. And those that were sent to exile also did not have a better end than those who were actually murdered. I would consider this as an interesting feature, more the tragic feature, I might say, that it speaks to some extent of what happened in the 20th century as well. So that's what I mean by looking at the broader context. This is the broader context to which we can talk. That, in a sense, the office of the minister or the prime minister, or the chief minister, never managed to maintain enough power to withstand the pressure that came from the monarchs and the allies of the monarchs. Even in the case of Mossadegh, you see the same phenomenon. Mossadegh is probably the last example of that class of secretarial class coming from a family of officialdom that served the Qajars with the same background, same kind of education, same kind of a training in the art of statecraft, as it was the case in the course of the 19th century. And if we believe that the fact that the early upbringing plays an important part in one's life and career, no doubt he never fully dissociated from that past. And that remained part and parcel of his mentality, his way of thinking, his fears, his anxieties and preoccupations. Even though he became far more modernized, he was a parliamentarian, he was a great believer of a constitutional regime, he was educated as a lawyer in Europe. But all of these perhaps other aspects that may cover but cannot entirely remove that past experience of the Qajar period. Lately, I have been looking at some of the early letters of what we consider as young Mossadegh, which I'm preparing for a critical edition that has not yet been published. And these are all letters from around 1907, 1908, for a brief period of time. But when you read these letters, the tone, the perspective, the worldview is still very much, these are the days before his departure for Europe to study law, is very much part and parcel of that world of the late Qajar era, with all the hazards to which I have referred. He was from a landed nobility with agrarian background. He had the same kind of grew in the same kind of a patronage networks. He created the same kind of a political alliances that in the past was a model and for many of the ministers. he engaged the same kind of a, one might say, uh, one might say, cornering the affairs of the government for a short period of time before being losing control over the system. So, since we are really reaching at the end of our time, let me make a couple of observations at the end. By the way of really looking at the case of ministers versus monarchs, one witnessed that irrespective of the fact that if the government would have been democratic, representative of the general public, or basically a representative of an autocratic regime, there is a differentiation with the model of government that developed in perhaps Europe or in the rest of the Islamic world, as I brought the case of the Ottomans. That this delegative versus executive problem was never resolved. And I would argue that it was not resolved. Perhaps in the question and answer, we can elaborate on that a little bit further. Even up to the present. I mean, one can look at the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran and notice that the office of first the prime ministers and then the presidents of the republic all been compromised and subverted by the authority of the supreme leader. So the same tension that you could have seen between the shahs and the wazirs, the ministers and the monarchs in the past, still has a very clear presence in today's Iran. I noticed that remarkably, 6 out of 7 of people in ministerial, the chief ministers or as presidents of the Islamic Republic had the same kind of a fate of being outcasts or marginalized or totally put out of the political discourse or forced out to exile, starting with Bazargan, then Mir Hossein Mousavi, Bani Sad, Rafsanjani, Khatami, Ahmadinejad, of all this, 6 out of 7, the last of them being Rouhani, who is still in office. So that continuity of this tension tells me something about this irresolvable, perhaps, issue of the position of the ministers versus the position of those who legitimize their own office by some extra political factors as being a divine representative, which in effect was also the case with the rulers in the Iranian system, as they claim to have the charisma that was basically conferred upon them by God directly, as being the shadow of God on earth. So it's that versus an office which had to represent the affairs of the people, the affairs of the state, and in a sense remain loyal to the realities of the political system. Now, I think, I don't know whether Dr. Farzani, do we have time to show some slides right now, or
We have about
would you
5.
like to take some questions?
You have about 5 minutes if you'd like to take that.
Okay, it may take a few minutes more, but I'll do my best to try to do it within 5 minutes. So I suppose I have to share screen here.
Yes.
Okay, there we are. I hope you would be able to see this screen.
Yes, it's nice and clear.
Okay, if we go back to the history of these ministerial versus rulers, the shahs and wazirs. I'm trying to see why. Okay, here we are. The painting that you see is probably considered as one of the greatest paintings of the Persian book illustration, tradition of book illustration, is from the very beginning of the Shahnameh. It's the court of Kayumars, who is the first man and the first king. By itself, it's also interesting that the first man in the mythology of the Shahnameh is associated with the first king. So there's a position of power associated with him. This is his court that consists of humans and animals, both. And you see that Kayumars is being portrayed here. Perhaps in the detail, you can see it better here. Kayumars sitting on his right is a figure which is referred to as Sarusha or Surush. This is indeed that divine figure that advises the ruler and probably the prototype of a minister. Of course, there are two ministers portrayed here, but the one it's on the right, which is the significant one, as the kind of a divine figure that brings the right message of justice, dad, that comes from God to the ministers. So in effect, this is a position between that delegative and executive power of the ministers. Then if you look further, this is from a painting of the 19th century based on an old story of Solomon, which was greatly popular in both the biblical and in the Quranic version of it. As you can see, Solomon is not only like Kayumars, not only is the king of the humans, but or the ruler of the humans, but the ruler of the animals too. He holds court and animals in a kind of a very environmentally conscious. They come to him and complain about humans, as you can see here in this picture. And then the figure on his right here is Barkhia, Asaf Barkhia, who is considered as the ultimate example of a ministerial counsel or ministerial guidance to Suleiman. This is Queen of Sheba on the right. This is a popular tradition of painting of the 19th century. And you can see there are also not only animals and humans, but there are demons as well that were brought under the control of the authority of the king, which is supreme here, as you can see. Okay. The next one, you can see the example of Buzurgmehr, which is a kind of considered as a kind of a prototype legendary minister of the Sasanian period under Khosrow I, Khosrow Anushiravan. This is again from the story of the Shahnameh. This is the text of the page. There's a detail of it, where Khosrow throws a banquet in honor of his minister, shown here, Buzurgmehr, and in which Buzurgmehr advises the king to administer justice and compassion. This is from a very remarkable manuscript of the 14th century Ilkhanid period in Iran. Now, pages of it in various museums. Tragic story, including some very famous ones in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There again, you can see that the minister has been associated with a great wisdom, as we saw in the previous examples. Here, that Sarusha turns into a wisdom for being very clever, in a sense, being very astute. This is an Ottoman manuscript of the Shahnameh, illustrated manuscript of the Shahnameh, whereby in the story in the Shahnameh, the Indian envoy brings the game of chess to the Sasanian court, and Buzarjumer or Buzurgmer is commissioned to or ordered to resolve the issue of how the game is played. It's all, of course, legendary and exaggeration. But as a matter of fact, there is some truth in it because the game of chess was brought to Iran from India. And here he is resolving the issue of chess, the game of chess, and yet at the same time presents the Persian game of backgammon, which is considered as, in the eyes of the Iranians, as a much more realistic game than chess, because there is an element of chance has been played into it. And that I brought here to try to show that how the ministers were considered, particularly in the case of Buzurgmer, as a model for wisdom. If we move all the way to the 20th century, this is under Reza Shah in the 1930s, when the Palace of Justice was built in Tehran. This is a scene in which shows Khosrow I and his chief minister Buzurgmer here administrating justice. And it's actually still remarkable because even in the 20th century, this remains still as a model for justice of the ministers. At the time when Reza Shah himself had absolutely no regard for the ministerial authority per se, or the independence of the autonomy of ministerial authority. Moving further, in the early 19th century, this is the example of the rise of the Qajars, which shows Agha Muhammad Khan, the founder of the dynasty, who was reluctant actually to occupy the office of the king. That's where you can see it doesn't have even a crown in the earlier days. And next to him stands the very crucial figure that actually revived the tradition of kingship in the Qajar period, is the minister Ibrahim Khan Etemad-ud-Dawla Shirazi, former mayor of the city of Shiraz, and a very crucial figure, sometimes portrayed or depicted as a betrayer to the Zands, the previous dynasty. But as a matter of fact, perhaps a very remarkable figure, who himself was a victim of execution by the next ruler, Fath Ali Shah. If we move further, by the mid-19th century, in this very remarkable book illustrations of the story of Thousands and One Nights, that's usually in Europe and the United States referred to as the Arabian Nights, you can see that the story of the Abbasid Caliphate Harun al-Rashid and his Persian minister Ja'far Barmaki was a subject for the painter to portray the Shah, Nasiruddin Shah, in his youth. Mirza Taqi Khan Amir Kabir here in the center is one of the earliest example of portrayal of Mirza Taqi Khan Amir Kabir. And the half-brother of Nasiruddin Shah, Abbas Mirza III, not the famous Abbas Mirza, but the half-brother of Nasiruddin Shah, that was the cause of eventually the Shah becoming almost paranoid about Amir Kabir trying to bring his half-brother to power, and eventually was a major cause for his execution. This is done by the famous painter of the period, Sani-ul Mulk, in 1859. I have an article about this for those of you who are interested. Or, as you can see, in the early years of Reza Shah, in perhaps around the late 1920s, in many of these pictorial rugs that were produced in kind of popular illustrations of kingship, you can see it's a very strange phenomenon. It's named after Nadir Shah Afshar, the famous ruler of the 18th century, and that presumably is Mirza Mehdi Khan Astarawadi, his famous minister. But as a matter of fact, if you take the head of Nadir out, this is the entire painting is all based on a painting of Fath Ali Shah of the Qajar period. So it's basically Fath Ali Shah and his minister that we saw earlier on in the other painting has been, the Fath Ali Shah's head was decapitated and Nadir's head was put on its place. Why? Because Nadir in the early years of the Reza Shah was seen as a prototype of this nationalist hero, the champion of in Iranian independence and reconstitution of the right monarchy, and was celebrated in many of the paintings of the period. As I said, young Mohammad Mossadegh, perhaps this is around 1908, I'm not sure, but my sense is that it's probably from that time when he was very young, before going to Europe. And he, as in his appearance, is a typical example of the member of the nobility belonging to the class of the officials with the same functions that his fathers and forefathers have been engaged in. So he basically very much is part of that tradition, as you can see here. But he has to juggle between various forces that, in effect, challenged his independence or autonomy of his office. Here, probably in 1951, at the outset of his position as the prime minister with the Shah, then young, and Queen Soraya, the second wife of the Shah, after the divorce of the first one, where there was a hope that some kind of a reconciliation in the relation between the two can occur. Or during the old dispute with the chief of the head of the Anglo-Iranian oil company, Richard Lord Stokes, that when he still was in the hope that he would be able to reconcile and bring about, and it was all the good intentions on the side of Mossadegh, it was only the intransigence of the officials of the AIOC that prevented that any kind of a compromise to emerge. So I brought this up again to try to show that how the minister has to deal with so many other, so many different constituencies when negotiating his own office and the precarious of his own office. Or as in this case in 1951, or perhaps beginning of 1952, in his trip to the United States, where you see him on the right with Harry Truman, when he was well received as a national hero of Iran, or on the left with Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, where he was negotiating a possible end to the crisis, to the oil crisis, about which, of course, much has been said and much has been written. But it's again an attempt to try to reconcile. This is at the time when the Americans tried to mediate between the British government and the Anglo-Iranian oil company and the Iranian government, or to deal with the religious establishment in Iran, or at least a certain sector within the religious establishment that was deeply engaged in political affairs. This is Ayatollah Kashani visiting Mossadegh, who often, because of his physical situation, has to stay at home and even receive guests in his bed when he was suffering from some ailment. And this is his Minister of Foreign Affairs in his last cabinet, Hossein Fatemi. And all of this pressure on him, added by an ideological factor, this is a very striking, rather, I might say, shameful representation. This is when he was lampooned as a dancer, entertaining his Anglo-American guests in a pro-Tudeh party, pro-communist party newspaper around 1951. As you can see, the way that he and members of his National Front were portrayed as being in the service of their guests, the British and the Americans, as you can see here. Or the last slide, you can see that again in the same newspaper, satirical newspaper, you can see he was lampooned as basically a baboon, being by a street entertainer, being in this case the United States Uncle Sam, and the way that Uncle Sam, as you can see here, being portrayed as the one that wears swastika on his hat. A way that how association with the Americans, when he pleaded to the Americans to help with the question of the oil dispute, was the subject of so much of ridicule from the left. I brought again here in order to point out that there were so many different challenges to the position of the minister to be able to deal with a more autonomous, independent control of the resources for the sake of state building as a project for development and reform. I stop here, and if there are questions, I would be happy to entertain, if we still have some time for that.
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you, Dr. Amanat, for that really thought-provoking talk. I have about, 7 questions myself, but I'll wait for those. But I think there is one question so far and more coming, so let me get to that one, read it out to you. The question says, what would you contribute to Dr. Mossadegh's belief and adherence to democratic principles when compared to many of the ministers of his time? How did he become enlightened? As we know, he was not the only one who traveled to Europe and studied there.
Thank you very much. Very difficult question to answer. I mean, people have different temperaments. And although, yes, if you compare him with several ministers or statesmen of his own time, that also coming from that kind of a similar background as he did, from this Qajar nobility of the class of the officialdom, he is the one who is more, in a sense, committed to the constitutional principles, at least for most of his career. I mean, one can see that towards the end of his career, probably one of his great mistakes is that he deviated a little bit by the fact that he engaged in a referendum, or there are other factors that played this very complex period towards the very end. But back to the question, as I said, when I was reading these early letters of his before his departure for Europe, you see a typical Qajar statesman here. He's negotiating, he's observing the first parliament, the first Majlis. He's not a member of the first Majlis because he was under 30. And according to the constitution, he could not be a representative. Although he was appointed, he was actually designated as a representative from Isfahan, but he did not get the office. You can see predictable person who has a kind of a typical attitude of a new generation of the nobility toward the constitutional revolution and constitutional process. This is just before the Civil War of 1908 that we have this collection of letters. Now, if you compare this with him coming back from Europe and being much more of a representative of, or much more of a spokesman of constitutional values, of representation, elections, limits of the power, the division of labor within the constitutional regime, you can see a major change. And I think probably it is possible to associate that with his education. I mean, yes, others have also visited Europe, also studied. There's a very good example of a contemporary of his is Hossein Pirnian, who was also a prime minister before he was in the pre-Reza Shah era, and of course later on a famous historian of pre-Islamic Iran. You see that he has also the same education. He also believes in the same kind of constitutional principles. So he's not the only one. Mossadegh is not the only one. But the force of circumstances puts him in a position that in effect makes him to decide on very crucial issues. And of course, what makes him also very remarkable is, I would say, kind of a moral fortitude that we can associate with this belief in democracy and constitutionalism, that he could withstand, that he could sacrifice a great deal for what he believed in. And as such, probably this kind of a chemistry of the time that puts him on the spot and makes him as a kind of a champion of constitutionalism and parliamentarism, of a sense of popular representation and the rule of law that he constantly, time and again, brought out. Of course, if you read my chapter in the book that we have mentioned, Dr. Farzani, you can see that I have also raised many issues with the practice of his government and weaknesses. I mean, he is a human being and he has weaknesses like everybody else. We need not to glorify him or to make him a hero per se without all the human failings that every politician may face, or non-politician for that matter.
Thank you so much. So what I was thinking, the term you use, Wazir-Said, which I find really fascinating, and I think it's very fitting in this situation. So for those of us who don't know, what can we attribute this attitude in the Persian political culture that we cannot, to save our life, respect an office that is either democratically elected or appointed, in the cases of, in the Qajar period? What can we attribute that to? Because I know it's not a solely Iranian thing, because we just had a president for 4 years that did not like the idea of cabinet ministries or cabinet secretaries doing their job freely. So I can't say it's a Middle Eastern Muslim thing, but I'm just wondering what you think of that.
Well, as I pointed out, I think if you want to have a kind of a social history interpretation of it, it all goes back to where you're coming from and what is your power base. And in most of the Islamic history, or for that matter, from China, I mean, because China is another example, from China to India to Ottoman world, you had two types of people reaching the office of the ministers, chief ministers. Either they are slaves, which is in the case of the Ottomans, particularly because they're all coming from the Sherma system that would recruited from the provinces, the Christian boys, and brought them to the service of the Ottomans, and they eventually reach high offices as the prime minister, as the Sadr Azam, or the chief minister. Or they are the secretarial class, that is people like Mossadegh, that in the Iranian case is very prominent. As I pointed out, they are families that for centuries were in positions of power. They had the skills of governing, in a sense, all the statecraft that was associated with them. Now, both of these, this is actually the, I think this is to your point, both of them are victims. So it's impossible, even when they have the independent networks, the loyalties, the source of income, the resources in their hand is not sufficient to face the pressure from the office of the rulers, basically, from the rulers. I mean, look at the case of Mirza Taqi Khan Amirkabir. He has the kind of combination of the both, because on the one hand, he belongs to this class of the divan, to this class of the officials, the state officials, and on the other hand, he's of a lower rank, that is, a son of a chief cook, and therefore he's considered as some kind of a servant, or what, for that matter, a slave. He refers in virtually all of his notes to the king as the ghulam. He is the servant of the king. And therefore, it is easy to try to dispose of them as far as the rulers are concerned, because they don't have enough resources to withstand. And enough resources in pre-modern times means military. And as soon as they lose control over the military, they are easy victims of the monarchical power. In the case of Amirkabir, he comes to power with the new army, Nizam Jadid, that he brings from Azerbaijan with him, brings the Shah to the power, puts him on the throne, pacifies the country, does all of the things that he did in 3 years. But as soon as he did whatever he did, he lost the Nizam Jadid. That's actually, if you look at the history of the period, the first step when he has lost basically his control over the government is that he loses the military. The same with Mossadegh in the 20th century. The army that was behind the Shah, and he very successfully managed to rebuild or restructure the sense of a monarchical authority that was from his father, Reza Shah. Mossadegh could never master. It was almost impossible for him to master that. And that was his greatest source of loss, basically. So that's why, to some extent, the background matters. If you look at, I mean, I don't want to generalize in this essentialist way, but if you look at the case of, let's say, Fazlullah Hamadani, Rashiduddin Fazlullah Hamadani, the great minister of the Ilkhani period, probably the greatest minister Iran has ever created. If you look at him, he is also the victim of the same phenomenon. He comes with a big family. He has the control of the machinery of the government, but he gradually, because of the loss of the military, he basically eventually is eliminated.
Outstanding. We are like 10 minutes off of our time, but before we go, I'd like to thank all the attendees. But before we go, this will be mailed to you, Dr. Amanat, but it's a little plaque as a way of appreciation. And let me read it. It says, Northeastern Illinois University and the Mossadegh Initiative recognize with appreciation Dr. Abbas Amanat of his commitment to education and philanthropy and the delivery of the 7th annual Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh Servant Leadership Lecture on April 15th, 2021. So
thank you so much.
Good. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for accepting our invitation and giving this fascinating talk. I look forward to that edited volume that you talked about. I think it's going to be a call for another talk, hopefully in person next year, once the book is out and once we get over the pandemic challenge. Let me thank Liesl Downey, again, Brandon DePrado, Anning Wu, Terrence Black, Damaris Tapia, everybody that helped make this event possible. And I believe, let me see, there was a question, but it was deleted, so that's all right. As I said, I have a lot of more questions, but maybe another opportunity. There is that raffle, so to speak, going on. So make sure that you go to the Google form that's going to be dropped soon, and you complete that. And if you'd like to get on our mailing list, of course, you could do that as well. And visit our website, neiu.edu. Mossadegh, and we love to hear from you. Again, we try to do a lot of things here in Chicago, and with the magic of Zoom now, I guess we can do this internationally and get more people involved, and I'm very happy about that. Thank you so much again, Dr. Amanat.
Thank you.
Have a great summer. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.
My pleasure.